Hello, my soccer universe. My name is Roland, and this is Football Talk. We're reviewing the second legs of the round of 16 in the Champions League, the Europa League, and in the Conference League. First, pointing out the bigger storylines that we had in these competitions. Then we go a little bit into what has happened and what will happen going forward. And who might be the favorites overall. All the good stuff. But let's start with the first big story. I'm wearing Sporting. Sporting, in a way, robbed us of the last real fairy tale in the Champions League. They beat Bodø Glimt, decisively so. And many questions have to be asked, actually, of Glimt in that one. Because, for a team that was so forward-facing, being so completely outplayed by Sporting, did not look good. And, losing 5-0 when you won the first leg 3-0, that's not something very good. I also have to say that Sporting in itself is actually a feel-good story. I mean, this was the one time where we knew there will be a smaller team going into the quarterfinals, and Sporting have played already an amazing group phase. They were a seeded team here. Let's not forget that. This is a Sporting team that lost Ruben Amorim last year. Got Rui Borges in, and he's actually doing an outstanding job as well. Yes, in the league they're behind. Porto is the outstanding team in Portugal at the moment, and we'll talk about Porto in just a little bit. But Sporting is now the stalwart in Europe, and given that they will play now Arsenal, you will say, okay, Sporting will be brushed aside by a great and all-conquering Arsenal team. I don't see that at the moment, that they're all conquering. And there is precedent. I think it was a couple of years ago in the Europa League. Arsenal were facing Sporting and got ousted by Sporting. So, hold your horses. This is not the time where everyone should say, oh, Arsenal is already through because they're the best team ever and Sporting is just a small side. This is not the case. And Sporting is actually part of a larger context because we have 3 Portuguese teams in the quarterfinals. Portugal actually did a whole lot for their coefficient. They are now currently in 4th place ahead of Italy for this year. They might not quite get into the running for the top 2 places, but they're at least close. So have that in mind as well. But it was not only Sporting had a big comeback, it was also Braga having a huge comeback. They lost 2-0 at Ferencváros, came back 4-0. And after 15 minutes, they had already equalized. At halftime, they were already ahead. And they played at times where no one could really watch them because that was in the afternoon. However, Braga, I think the fans are also in a little bit of a conflict with the club leadership there. So in the end, it did not matter. And it will continue that the Braga home games, especially with Porto also playing on Thursdays, since the cities are so close, they're kind of kept apart. Which I find curious because we had quite a few games in London this week in the Champions League. So I don't know, but I guess London is a much bigger area, blah, blah, blah. In any case, I just wanted to have that mentioned. And then, as I said, the all-conquering Porto. The gold standard this year in Portugal. And if you look where Porto was last year, the years before, Porto were the 3rd best team at best in Portugal. Now they're clearly the best. Faroli doing an absolutely amazing job. And I think it is very much overlooked that Porto ousted a Stuttgart team that is in really good form in Germany. This Stuttgart team gave Porto their all. But Porto is extremely wily, extremely smart. And I would not be surprised should Porto make a deeper run in this competition. If not win that one. Because they are extremely well coached, they are durable, they know exactly what to do and they can strike at any moment. Faraoli is that kind of coach. The only negative that you have so far on his CV is that he basically threw away the title with Ajax last year. He went to Portugal and he's doing again an amazing job. He's probably at the moment maybe the most overlooked Italian coach of them all because he's not sexy in a way. He's no nonsense. And in that sense, I would have to say Porto has to be considered a huge contender for the Europa League trophy. They might meet Braga again. And we had that Porto against Braga final 15 years ago. I'm not saying that Braga will get there. I think you probably will need a little bit more support, but Porto does have that support. So overall, a really good week for Portuguese teams. As I said, big wins on aggregate. Sporting coming back, beating Glimt, fully deservedly so, and it was in a way epic because there was the Lisbon rain. There was something about the stadium was absolutely rocking. And I think that Sporting is not done yet. Under Amorim, they beat Pep's City. I just want to say they can do something against Arsenal as well. I would give, of course, the favorite to Arsenal. I mean, that would be insane if I say Sporting are the favorites, but I think Sporting are not without a chance in this tie. Arsenal better buckle up, but then again, Arsenal will probably rely too much on dead ball situations and so on. We had Braga coming back and Porto. I said already that. So the Portuguese teams doing really, really, really well. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of them would go on to win a trophy. Don't think Sporting will win the Champions League though. And with that we come probably to another big storyline. That is the great dying of English teams, especially in the Champions League. The Premier League had 6 teams in the round of 16 and only 2 made it through. This means, unlike in the round of 16, the most teams of a single league in the quarterfinals of the Champions League are coming from Spain. And everyone is saying, yeah, we have been over-exaggerating. And you saw it on my channel as well, my series on the map that could save Europe, where I've said the Premier League is an absolute behemoth. I've also heard the statement by Michel Platini, lions in winter, kittens in the spring. I'm not saying that there might be a certain trend with all these statements there. But what I'm saying is, these results, especially in the Champions League, are not coming as a surprise. Yes, we are at a point where we have 6 Premier League teams in the Champions League. We are at a point where 2 bad Premier League teams waltzed to a Europa League title, a Europa League final, and in the end a title last season. We are in such a world. However, and I've said this also in my video series, we're not living in a Premier League only world. We have the Premier League, plus we have a few super clubs. And what actually happened? Well, all the Premier League teams that got ousted arguably met better opposition. You played against Real Madrid, against Barcelona, who are the extended family. You played against PSG, also extended family, the plus super club side. Bayern is in that one as well. Those are teams that can hold their own with the Premier League teams. But they're only just a few. And that's also the extent of it. The only Premier League team that I got ousted, where you wouldn't say this is a super team, but they are very much working on getting there, was Spurs against Atletico Madrid. But this is mostly down to Spurs having a really torrid time at the Metropolitano early on. Because if you look at it, if you scrap the first 15 minutes, Spurs actually beat Atletico Madrid over that one. And that is a torrid Spurs side. So Atletico Madrid got only through because Igor Tudor probably made a wrong call. Because a goalkeeper was too young to be and overpowered by everything. And Atletico Madrid did take care of that. But as soon as that goalkeeper went out, the game finished from that moment on 2-2 in Madrid, and then Spurs won 3-2. Yes, Atleti were never really in danger, but Spurs 3 times took the lead. That also shows the power that the Premier League actually has, that a bad Spurs team is actually still holding kinda sorta their own with an Atletico Madrid team that is not the class of La Liga, but that is sitting comfortably in 3rd place. And the gap was not as big as the final result showed, because this was all down to that goalkeeper, Kinski, who was put in there, and I really don't want to blame him for that, but that is the root why Spurs got ousted. I actually think playing a normal lineup, this might have been much, much tighter. Still, Atleti may have gone through, but this would have been much, much tighter. And then when you see the teams that are going through, I mean, Liverpool and Arsenal, they just met inferior opposition. They got through easily. I mean, Liverpool really got through easily. And so the whole thing, to me, is much overblown. Yes, it is true that the Premier League teams will probably not take Europe as full as maybe other teams from other leagues do. This is, I think, definitely an issue here. because the Premier League is so lucrative and Premier League teams are so familiar that it's much, much tighter everything as well. I mean, the Champions League was just crazy, a goal explosion everywhere. Manchester City, probably we would have said, are favorites against Real Madrid, but then Real Madrid took advantage of their weaknesses in the first leg. And then Real Madrid is still Real Madrid in this competition. That is a team that you just have to kill once, twice, 3 times to make sure that they're out of the competition. Because as soon as the Champions League anthem and a big night at the Bernabeu comes, something flips there. This is also a force. I think only Anfield has a similar force happening. But I really do not believe that the Premier League is in any crisis whatsoever. I think for me, maybe the most surprising ousting was Manchester City. But then, it's Real Madrid. Chelsea, yes, they beat a PSG side in the World Club Cup final, but I think there were circumstances there. PSG have not looked good, but suddenly against Chelsea, they look like world beaters. Especially in the return leg. They got it done early. And so I think Chelsea were an inferior side, and Chelsea that was on a high coming from the win of the Conference League, going to Club World Cup, where they basically didn't have to beat any huge sides to get into that final, is a much different side than what we have now as well. So circumstances, and again, it's Premier League plus super clubs, and this is what we get in the Champions League. Now it will be interesting to see how these two Premier League teams would fare going forward, but honestly, even if they all get ousted, to me this doesn't diminish the dominance of the Premier League. We also see it a little bit in the Europa League. Yes, I think except Villa, Palace and Forest did not advance with showering themselves in glory, but these are also rather middling teams, and Villa themselves are not in great form. Villa easily breezed past Lille. There's still a lot of power there, and the Premier League is deep. And they still, after losing 4 teams, they still have 5 alive in Europe. And in each competition, it's the Premier League teams that are the favorites to win it all. I think it's way too early to say that the Premier League is done. And before we run through what happened in the midweek, I also want to talk about the coefficient race. It also says Premier League is all the way on the top. They more or less have sewn up their top spot, and Spain is in a really good position, being almost a point. I think it's about 0.8 ahead of Germany. And Spain have 6 teams alive, Germany only 3. So I think Spain will get that second spot. So for a second year in a row, it will be England and Spain. Those are the 2 best leagues, at least in terms of club coefficients. At the moment, Portugal, I said, it's a footnote that they are ahead of Italy, and they also have still more teams alive and probably in good positions than Italy. Italy have only 2, Portugal 3, and the games for Italy are divided by 7, for Portugal 5 by 5. So this definitely favors Portugal. France losing also quite a few teams will probably also not really augment. But it's basically England and Spain have their top 2 spot and will get a 5th spot very, very, very soon. And with that, let's just look at what happened in the Champions League and how it will look like going forward. Now, I really don't want to gloat or tell you I told you so, but what I did say and what I have observed over the years is that the Champions League is crazy. That even though a tie seems like it's over, there's still one of those that could get tied, and some of those might get tied, and there might be something else. And we had that. The first game, as I said, already in a preamble, Sporting flattened Bodo Glimt. And as I said, I really don't understand why Glimt went so defensively. That was not a Glimt-like performance. Rather disappointing. Sporting really moved on, deservedly so. Then the only other close tie that we had was between Arsenal and Leverkusen. And yes, Blaswich kept Leverkusen alive in the first half, but then a beautiful goal by Eze and a nice strike by Rice, where I have to say the clearance from Leverkusen was not good. And Arsenal did not really have to extend themselves. PSG got the job done early. You potentially, because they have beaten them in the Club World Cup final, thought that Chelsea, if they can get the crowd behind them, could do something very, very, very quickly. Kvara takes care of a young Chelsea player, I think who started or made his debut. And these frailties will be exposed. Makes it 1-0 Bakola. Brilliant goal, Mayulu. Kills it off, and PSG look like world beaters suddenly again. Let's see what it will happen in the next round. But it seems like when PSG face Premier League teams, they reach a different level. That is also, and now the Liga is also potentially going more in their way. We gotta see. There was never really anything between City and Real Madrid. Guardiola can say they played great 15 minutes. They were already 3-0 down, then they lose Bernardo Silva for the chicken wing on the goal line. Vinny makes it 1-0, and he adds then also the winning goal late on. I was actually surprised that Haaland, with a man down, got the goal, but even on the celebration you could see he was not really believing in that one. I am sorry. No, I'm actually not sorry to say I didn't see Barcelona-Newcastle except on highlights, because there was a way more important game for me going on, which was Lusk in the Cup semi-final against local rivals Reed. An ugly game. Lusk is in the final. Yay! I'm so happy about that. The Barcelona-Newcastle game was actually quite open. I mean, when you see the highlights, up until Barcelona got the penalty just before the half, this was a way open game. Yes, Barcelona had probably more, but their defense is so frail. But then they made a few shifts around, and then right after the half, boom, 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 7-2. And probably this could have gotten really ugly. Newcastle have again one of those seasons. Either they play in the Champions League and are middling, or they're out of Europe, and then suddenly they can get high. They need to solidify there as well. Bayern Atalanta, I mean, it's not even worth mentioning, except that Harry Kane is just awesome. I mean, the goal where all the Atalanta players are all over him and he still gets it in. It's embarrassing for Atalanta, I have to say. It's embarrassing for Serie A. But then, this was not the highest ever scoreline, and I also remember Bayern beating Arsenal a few years back on an aggregate score of 10-2. So we have to see. Bayern want to do that. It just doesn't tell us much about Bayern. The only really interesting game was Liverpool against Galatasaray. However, Osimhen came off relatively early on in Galatasaray. You knew, the way they already let it go at Juve and then just fought back because they had a man more. You knew that Liverpool is going to do that. Szoboszlai with a really nice goal. Salah misses a penalty, but then after the half, they take it 4-0. Beautiful Salah goal. In that moment, you would have feared for worst. Noah Lang, extremely ugly injury with his thumb, something you don't want to even think about. Fortunately, it was not a severed thumb, but yeah. And I already said a lot about Spurs against Atleti, where I really thought, if those first 15 minutes at the Metropolitano don't happen, I think it might have been an open tie. And Atleti seem vulnerable. Good thing for them that they are taking on one of the most defensively vulnerable teams in the quarterfinal. However, their offense is something in a completely different stratosphere. So let's look actually at the quarterfinals and especially the chances. We have Real Madrid against Bayern Munich, the most played tie in the European Cup Champions League. It's the standout tie. Bayern have to be considered favorites. Real Madrid usually find a different level. But this is, for me, a real test, because Bayern are in great, great, great form. At least now. This will be played after the international break. Things might change back then. Then Sporting against Arsenal. Of course, Arsenal are prohibitive favorites. I told you, Sporting will not go over easy. At least that's my gut feeling. And now they're going to lose the first leg 5-0. Now, I don't see Arsenal doing that. I actually think this will be much tighter than many expect. Then we have Barcelona against Atleti. What a crazy tie is that? Barcelona against Atleti. And now it's the other way around. This time Barcelona will play first and Atleti second. And they will meet each other 3 times in 10 days. They're first a league game and then they have the double. The league game will be a throwaway, I think. But then they meet in the Champions League. And yeah, we have to see. The Copa del Rey semi-final was already something else. I also have to say that. And Atleti have a history of taking apart Barcelona, putting Barcelona out of the competition so Real Madrid can swoop in and beat Atletico Madrid in the final, as they always do. Just have this little thing in mind, that this is not that this is a true stumbling. This is an opponent that Barcelona does fear. And Atleti have the players to hurt Barcelona on the back. However, if I look at the return leg, how Barcelona went all over Atleti and almost turned around the 4-0 deficit. Will be an interesting one. Will be a dicey one, for sure. And then we have a replay of last season's round of 16 matchup where PSG really hit the next level. PSG against Liverpool. Up until that point last season, Liverpool seemed like infallible, and then PSG took them apart at the Parc des Princes. Still, they lost at home. Scored an early equalizer, and Donnarumma made some great saves, lost on penalties. I'm actually looking forward to that one. One of these teams probably should find form here, and I think that team will be PSG. Very, very interesting one. And I also have to say PSG then taking on the PSG or Liverpool taking on the winner of Real Madrid or Bayern. That's also a very tasty semi-final. We have to see who will come out of the other one. If it's Barcelona against Arsenal or Sporting, of course, this will be nice. I'm not sure if Atleti, especially against Arsenal, will give a whole lot of counter there. I think Atleti will be outmatched by Arsenal. Curiously enough, not by Barcelona. Okay, let's go over to the Europa League. Actually, quite an interesting evening yesterday. It was a whole lot tighter. There were a few turnarounds. We already talked about the Braga-Ferencváros. That happened. We had another huge turnaround. I mean, it was not that huge, but Genk had a 1-0 lead. Were the better team in the first leg. But Freiburg had gone ahead already before the half. Then Genk pulls one back. But after the half, stupid playing out error. And former last keeper Toby Laval could not do much. And Freiburg ran away 5-1 winners. This is the farthest they ever got in a European competition. So this quarterfinal is historic for Freiburg, and they are one of the few German teams left standing. Curiously enough, the three German teams that are left, they are on very different levels. But Freiburg is actually a true feel-good story because this is a club that's run right. Lyon is in utter disarray. Of the last 7 games, they have not won a single one. Concede a red card. Also, I think the second one later on in Celta scored the two goals to move on. It's also a deep run for Celta, but they had those before. Forest against Midtjylland. I think Forest actually, if this would have gone right, they were overall the better team on that night. They had the 2-0 lead. Midtjylland pulled one back. Then they scored 2 goals in overtime. It probably shouldn't have even gone to overtime. Still, they're both offside. The first one is where I think one of Forest play was pushed offside, which can this not be considered in a way? But then goes to penalty. It was a very curious penalty shootout where Midtjylland could not convert a single penalty. In fact, they twice hit the same post in succession and then missed the third one. So it was a rather easy win in that sense for Forest, but it was a whole lot of hard work, and I'm not sure if they liked that they had to go to overtime and have a really big game coming up in the Premier League this weekend. Probably the best tie. Roma against Bologna. What a game! What a game! And Bologna move on with a 4-3. I mean, if you would have said 2 Italian sides meet and there will be 7 goals, after already the first leg was just a 1-1 but could have had more goals, you would not have believed that one. And it was Bologna who actually really were outplaying Roma. Castro scoring 2 goals in there. They had a 3-1 lead. However, Roma fought back. But just at the moment when Roma thought that they have the upper hand, towards the end of regulation, Bologna were already the better team and they strike in the overtime. And Roma have no answer. They want to have a penalty, but honestly, never a penalty. Never a penalty. And so Bologna surprisingly move on, and Roma have pooped away their entire season in the past few weeks. They had a 3-1 lead against Juventus. They looked like set to finish in the top 4 into Champions League places. Somehow Juventus managed an equalizer, and since then Roma are on the slide. And they lost probably one of their better chances to make it into the Champions League, because now Como have also beaten them. Roma are very much looking again at a Europa League, if not a Conference League campaign for the next season. Given that the good start that they had, that it seemed for a long time that they might actually play in the Champions League next year, this is a big disappointment. But then also injuries have to be mentioned too. Villa, no trouble against Lille overall. I mean, 2-0. Lille are not as great of a side as they used to be, but still, for a Villa team that's also struggling in the Premier League, this is probably their best path into the Champions League, and I think Villa is probably banking everyone there. And they have, with Emery, probably the nous to actually get it over the line. Betis completely flattened Panathinaikos. In the first leg, Betis were maybe the better team, but didn't play well, and then ended up losing. This time, they left no chance. Great goal by Amrabat, by the way. And as I said, Porto really got the job done as well. Yes, Stuttgart really gave their all. And it was one of those games where a German-speaking commentator, mostly Austrian or Germans, and I hear those, they say, Stuttgart are working so hard and they're playing so well. However, they leave themselves open on the back, and this is what this Porto team is exploiting, and that's why I think it was not so undeserved that Porto moved on even with that scoreline, even though Stuttgart are a fun side to watch, I gotta say. And so we have a very interesting quarterfinal in Freiburg taking on Celta. Celta the favorites there. I think that sounds about right. Bologna against Villa. Villa have to be considered the favorites. I think Roma-Villa would have been probably tighter, although who knows. But Bologna under Italiano, they had this wobble in the winter, but now they're finding themselves again. I really, yeah, maybe. But Villa should be the better team. I think Porto against Forest, that's a really interesting one. That will be a tight one. I would really give the advantage to Porto, and then Braga against Betis, an Iberian duel. Betis should be considered the favorites there, but it's all not a foregone conclusion. By the way, Villa will then play the winner of Freiburg against Celta, and Porto Forest or Bologna Villa will be the other semi-final. So we will not have a Premier League with Premier League final. Just stating it there. I think it's the only thing what we could have is a Portuguese final. All Portuguese final, which I actually think I would in a way enjoy because it would be something different. But I actually would like to have two teams from two different countries. That's what I want to have in a European final. If you looked at the first leg results in the Conference League, you probably would have picked every single team that would have gone through, and you might have worried a little bit about Palace and maybe a little bit about Fiorentina. But the rest seem to be rather foregone conclusions, and this is exactly what we got. All the favorites got through, but the pathway there, anything but straightforward. Look at Ajax against Celje, a 4-0 lead for the first leg. At halftime, Celje had already made up 2 of those. Yes, Ajax then held on and went through 4-2 an aggregate. Not great. Palace struck early through Sar, but then as soon as they got a little bit more passive, Larnaca actually managed the equalizer. Just when they got the upper hand, the goal scorer was actually sent off with a red card, and then Palace scores early in overtime, and then proceeded to 3 times hit the post, one in the same attack, and then very late on an empty net, they also hit only the post. But Palace are through and have to be considered probably the favorites for the competition. Mainz against Olmütz, yes, finally they get through. Sigma were just defending. In the end, Posch, Austrian national team player, gets the breakthrough goal. And Mainz are one of the 3 German teams left standing. So with Bayern, Freiburg, Mainz, that's a weird trio. That's a really weird trio, I have to say. Fiorentina in the end won it with an empty net goal. However, Rakov had equalized right after halftime. They were with a 2-1 deficit. They managed to equalize. Then again, Fiorentina got the equalizer, slightly deflected shot, and laid on the win it when Rakov was pushing really forward. So not an easy win for Fiorentina this one. However, 2 wins for the Italian coefficient. At least something. Rayo also go through by the skin of their teeth. They lose at home to Samsunspor, so it was only by a single goal. This was really squeaky bum time. And similarly, Schachter against Lech Poznan. I upped Schachter so much. And Schachter Kuroslav had to play this home tie in Poland against a Polish team. Couldn't we have moved that to Germany, at least? Lech had equalized on aggregate through Ishak. At halftime, Schachter pulled one back. They have a player sent off. It was an onslaught by Lech. But Schachter hang on and move on. But I'm not feeling as high about Schachter anymore as I did a week ago. AZ actually got the job done rather patently. I mean, ruthless against Sparta. Ruthless. Every chance that they had went in. Sparta tried to overcome the 1-goal deficit, but AZ were just that much better. And then Strasbourg also, you would have assumed winning 2-1 in Rijeka, they will go through Rijeka at halftime, had equalized. Yes, Strasbourg then get the equalizer around the 70th and so on the night and go ahead on aggregate. Had then a few chances, so overall they move on, deservedly so, but it was not straightforward at all. That keeps the Conference League actually quite open, because if we look now at the quarterfinal setup, we have two actually pretty big games in Crystal Palace against Fiorentina and Mainz against Strasbourg. Big games in the sense that these are all big name country matchups. So I think that's definitely interesting. Those will be the ones that stand out. Rayo against AEK. Will AEK have a chance against the might of Rayo? Might of Rayo in Europe? We don't have that really. And then Shakhtar against AZ. I think is interesting, but definitely outside. Shakhtar are the favorites, according to my model for that one, as of course Palace, Strasbourg and Rayo. Shakhtar and AZ will play then the winner of Crystal Palace against Fiorentina. I have a feeling AZ will do that. And AZ could provide some trouble to the winner between Palace and Fiorentina. I think it will be Palace. And then, Rayo against AEK, I think is tighter than one would expect, although Rayo would have to be favored, and I also think Strasbourg should be favored over Mainz. So not the greatest teams in there. The biggest name in there, if you were to ask me, is clearly and without doubt Fiorentina. But I don't think Fiorentina is the best team left standing. Well, that was a full week, and I have to say I think Thursday was more enjoyable than Tuesday and Wednesday, unless you like a whole lot of other scores. But I personally don't watch football for the scores. I watch it for the excitement. And yes, if there are many goals scored and it's a tight game, that adds to the excitement. But we didn't get this in the Champions League. The Champions League really shows the gap that we have between the real top teams and the rest. I mean, how Barcelona just ousted Newcastle 7-2. 3 halves, it was rather level. And then, boom, 1 half, and away they go. It is what it is. But at least the Europa League and the Conference League, those were all really tight. Just the fact that we had 2 Premier League teams going to overtime, although they went through, shows already how tight it is, even though the opposition is not a hallowed one. And it also shows that these competitions, that when you peel back the layer of the top clubs, that everything is actually kind of tightish. And it definitely benefits that some of the clubs that are left standing, especially in Conference League, are battling relegation. Rayo, Fiorentina, Palace is also not going high. They're in their own kind of funk. So that adds to the drama of making it tighter. I just wish again that these competitions would get a little bit more media focus. And maybe really, let's go back, the teams from the Champions League drop down to the Europa League, from the Europa League down to the Conference League. I think it would help these competitions to get a few bigger names in there, make it more appealing. Although by themselves, I think they're quite interesting. And I love to watch games that are relatively tight. How do you see the whole thing? Leave a comment below. What did you enjoy in the midweek the most? I personally enjoyed the Cup semi-final the most because we won completely undeservedly. But we're in the final. And we're looking good to finally win a title in 61 years again. But that is not European football, that's Austrian football. I have my own podcast for that, but that's in German also. In any case, please, if you enjoyed this episode, tell somebody else. Leave me a subscription. And one thing's for certain, I'll talk to you soon about more things in my soccer universe very soon. Bye.